This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video, I'd like to provide students of all ages with some help working through the content of the second lesson in the Academy's Latin vocabulary course. You can see that we're studying an old book, the Orbis Sensualium Pictus, that was composed by John Comenius. And even though the Academy is a Catholic program and I'm a Catholic classicist, John Comenius was a Protestant, and this book that he produced is really invaluable for Latin vocabulary studies, and as we're also studying in Greek vocabulary. This book became a great source of topical vocabulary study, which is very helpful for Latin students of all ages. It was one of the first picture books, if not the first picture book ever published, and it's just a unique historical Latin study resource that I enjoy studying and teaching through and recommend to Catholic students. Now, we may run into an occasional issue that's worth commenting on or correcting, but that's fine because there's so much good in this book that any correction that's needed is worth the effort. So I'd like to pick up and continue our study with lesson 2 here, and you can see up at the top of the page that the topic of this second lesson is God, God himself, in Latin, Deus. So we're going to learn vocabulary that relates to God as a subject, and you can obviously see how valuable this will be because, well, as we learn the vocabulary that's taught in this lesson, we're not concerned with random vocabulary. None of us are going to speak Latin. Schools and teachers who do that, I think, are greatly wasting time. We're going to be reading and studying primarily Christian resources where the knowledge of Latin is helpful. So building our Christian Latin vocabulary is a priority. If we decide to pursue pure classical studies where we're going to get into real Latin text, Roman texts, things like that, well, then we would need to expand our vocabulary to be familiar with all of the concepts and names used in Roman literature. But our priority is preparing ourselves to be able to access Christian literature that's written in Latin, whether it's the sacred scriptures in the Vulgate, whether it's prayers in Latin, the liturgy, hymns, and so on. All of that is based on a basic Christian vocabulary. So it's good for us to focus on topical vocabulary studies that relate to Christian subjects, and obviously the chief subject of Christian studies is God himself. So let's study through this list. I'd like to walk through all of the Latin text and make sure that the translation of everything is easily understood. I'd also like to make some comments on the grammar that we encounter for more experienced students to help make this especially helpful for them. But I'd like to make sure that you understand the English translation over here and that anything that's not clear is cleaned up for you so you can study and complete this lesson. So the subject is God, and here we see an image of the Trinity. We see Pater in the top left here. We see Filius, and then we see Spiritus Sanctus down here. So we have this image of the Trinity. And in the middle, we have the Hebrew name of God, which some translate into English as Yahweh, some as Jehovah, but that's the name that God gives, the I Am. So we've got this image of the Trinity representing God himself, the nature and essence of God. So let's walk through this text together. I'll read one sentence at a time and then walk through the translation word by word to make sure everything is crystal clear. So follow along with me. Remember, as a student with a video lesson, you're in control of the lesson. You're in control of the video, so you can pause, back up, rewatch things, watch this video over again as often as you want. So I'm not going to teach as I would if we were together in a classroom. where I would need to make sure that everyone was following along and I would need to stop and review. You can stop and review anytime. So I'm just going to move through the lesson and leave the control of the video to you to study with. So let's begin here. Reading this first sentence in Latin. Deus est ex se ipso ab aeterno in aeternum. Deus est ex se ipso ab aeterno in aeternum. And just one note on pronunciation. We have this diphthong, a, e. In classical or Roman Latin, this would have been pronounced I. You would hear both of the sounds of those vowels, a and e, joined together in one syllable. It would be aeterno, aeterno. But in ecclesiastical Latin, that diphthong changes its pronunciation. It's simplified into the sound e. So Deus est ex se ipso ab aeterno in aeternum. We see that in these lessons there are some words in italics. Those are considered the main vocabulary words, but because we have the convenience of studying this at our own pace, we're going to make sure we learn all of the content of these lessons. So let's look. We have Deus, which is translated as God. Deus in Greek, this is theos, and you can see how theos and deus are similar between the two languages. Deus, God. Deus est, God is. Est is the verb is. Deus est. Ex se ipso. Ex is a preposition. It's always followed by a noun in the ablative case. So this here is a prepositional phrase. So we want to keep these two words together. And so we have Deus est ex se ipso. Se ipso means himself. Ex se ipsu, from himself or of himself. Deus est ex se ipso. God is from himself. This verb est can also be translated, when we get into theological or philosophical texts, we may need to adjust the translation a little bit because is very simple. Whereas when you see this, God is of himself, you can see the idea here in the verb is more like exists. God exists of himself. And this verb esse, to be, expresses that idea of existence or subsistence. So sometimes in philosophical writings or theological writings, you'll see the simple verb to be, and you should consider whether translating it as exists or subsists may be more helpful for the context. So God is of himself. God is of himself. God exists of himself. Ab aeterno in aeternum. Ab is a preposition, so it's followed by an ablative case. So we're going to have the preposition followed by the noun in the ablative case, which we have here, and we're going to translate this as a prepositional phrase. Ab means from, away from, and eterno is the Latin word for eternity, or here it's translated everlasting. So God exists of himself from eternity past. That means he never had a beginning. He exists of himself. He has existed from eternity past. And then we have another preposition, in, and I want you to notice that in here is followed by an accusative case, now. Now, I know if you're just getting started in Latin, you probably haven't studied grammar yet, don't know too much about cases and things like that. So just follow along. This will be helpful for you when you do study grammar because you'll have some examples that you can look back on. Notice that we have a preposition followed by an ablative case, eterno, and then we have another preposition followed by a different case, the accusative case, eternum. This preposition in can be followed sometimes by an ablative, as in the beginning of the Gospel of John, we read in principio, just like this, in principio. When in is followed by the ablative case, it is often translated in a certain number of ways. But when in is followed by an accusative case, it's translated in different ways. So knowing the meaning of in by itself is not enough. We've got to understand that this preposition in, its translation is affected by the case that follows it. When we have in followed by the ablative case, the preposition in is usually translated as in English. It can also be translated as with or on. But when in is followed by the accusative case, it usually has the idea of motion into. So we have here, God exists of himself, from eternity into eternity, or to eternity. And you see that notion of motion when in is followed by the accusative case. God exists of himself from eternity, from everlasting to eternity. So he's always existed and always shall exist. So remember that preposition in, which we'll see all the time, when it's followed by an accusative case, it has this idea of motion into or to or unto. And so we need to be careful to translate it correctly based on the case. So Deus est ex se ipso ab eterno in eternum. Next, perfectissimum et beatissimum ens. Perfectissimum et beatissimum ens. To begin with, in this sentence, the subject is at the end here, ens, which means being. God is a being, but he is a certain kind of being. He is a perfectissimum et beatissimum being. In this word perfectissimum, we see this ending, issimum, and we see it here also in beatissimum. Perfectum would be the adjective. If we wanted to say God is perfect, we would say perfectum ens. If we wanted to say God is blessed, we would say God is beatum ens, a blessed or happy being. But that's not what we want to say here. We want to say that God is the most perfect. God is the happiest. We want to use the superlative degree of this adjective. The superlative degree is the highest degree of the adjective. So we're saying that God is unique in his perfection and blessedness. He is the most perfect, the perfectest, as it were. So as we have that est ending in English, that shows the superlative degree of an adjective, like happiest means most happy. You can see it's translated most here in the English. But that issimum ending, issimus, issima, issimum, that ending is equivalent to the English ending est, which marks the superlative degree. So perfectissimum, the most perfect, et beatissimum, the most blessed, ens, being. Deus est ex se ipso ab eterno in eternum. Perfectissimum et beatissimum ens. The most perfect and most blessed being. And he was so ab eterno, and he will be so in eternum. He has always been and will always be the most perfect, most complete, in need of nothing, and most happy, most blessed being. Moving on, essentia spiritualis et unus. Essentia spiritualis et unus. Now, if you look at this word essentia, you'll notice it's in italics because it's a key vocabulary word. But if you look at the end, you'll notice that there's a mark over that last ah. It's called a caret in modern English. But what that's showing us is that ah at the end of the word essentia is a long vowel. And you might wonder why would they do that? Why would they go through the trouble of showing us that there's this random long vowel at the end of the word? And the reason why is because that's showing us that essentia is in the ablative case. It's in the ablative case. Because the ending of the ablative case has a long ah, whereas normally it would be a short ah. So essentia is not just a regular nominative noun like Deus. It's in the ablative case. And that's why if you look at the English translation, you'll see it's translated in essence. In essence. It doesn't just say essence as if it's a nominative noun. It says in essence. The word his here is added in the translation. It's not in the Latin. So in essence, and you can see they just added in his essence because the subject is God. In essence, he is, the verb is assumed, it's not given here in the Latin. In essence, he is spiritualis et unus. He is spiritual, that is, he has no body, and he is one. He is one. In essence, he is spiritual and one. There is one God, and God, as we learn in the Catechism, is a perfect spirit, most perfect and spiritual. In essence, he is spiritual, spiritualis, et unus, and he is one in number. Next we learn hypostasi trinus. Hypostasi trinus. Notice here in this word hypostasi, we see a letter Y. The letter Y is used to show the Greek vowel upsilon, which in Latin is igraika or igreka. So this is not the letter U in Latin. This is an example of a word that's drawn from Greek, and when it's drawn from Greek, it brings this vowel upsilon with it into Latin. That's why in Latin grammar we learn that there are 6 vowels in Latin: a, e, o, and u, and there's also the Greek vowel y or y or upsilon, which is borrowed from Greek. We see an example of that here. Hypostasi trinus. We can translate that Y as I did. I translated as an E. That's why it's called E Greca in Latin. Hypostasi. Or if you wanted to give it a more perfect translation, you would have to use a special sound. I'll make it here. Hypostasi. We make that by rounding our lips and making the sound of E inside of our mouth. It's a difficult sound for English speakers to make because it's not used in English. Hypostasi trinus. Hypostasi means personality. Notice it says in personality because hypostasi, again, is in the ablative case. So in personality, he is trinus. He is 3. So he is 1 in essence and 3 in personality, hypostasi. 1 in essence, 3 in person or personality, hypostasi trinus. So we have here in these 2 lines, we have the doctrine of the Trinity presented to us. Essentia spiritualis et unus, hypostasi trinus. In essence, he is spiritual and 1 in number. In personality, he is 3. Next, voluntate sanctus justus clemens verax. Voluntate, again, in the ablative case, the nominative form is voluntas. So if you were to look it up in a dictionary, you would look up voluntas, and it means the will. And since it's in the ablative case, it's translated in will. Again, his is just added for the sake of translation, but the Latin simply says in will, because voluntates in the ablative case. In will, so in his will, he is sanctus, which means holy. Justus, which means just or righteous. Clemens, which means merciful. And verax, which means true. In his will, he is sanctus, holy, justus, just, clemens, merciful, and verax, true. You know, when we pray the Salve Regina, we refer to Mary as clement. That means merciful, right? In his will, so if we were to understand the will of God, we would understand that in his will he is holy, just, merciful, and true. Sanctus, justus, clemens, and verax. And these are all adjectives. Moving on, potentia maximus. Potentia maximus. And again, notice at the end of potentia, we see that symbol over the a, which tells us it's long, which tells us it's in the ablative case. Potentia maximus. In his power, or potency. In power, maximus. Maximus is the superlative degree for great. Maximus, you see it's translated here, very great. We could also translate it most great or greatest. He is greatest in power. He is most great in power. He is very great in power. So notice another possible translation of the superlative degree for a Latin adjective. In power, he is very great, most great, greatest. Bonitate optimus. Bonitate optimus. Bonitate is in the ablative case, it means goodness. Bonitate. In goodness, he is optimus. Optimus. That's the superlative degree of the adjective good. So in English, we have good, better, best. In Latin, we have bonus, and then we have optimus, which means best. So in his goodness, he is the best. He is the most good. He is very good. So we have in power, he is the greatest. In goodness, he is the best. Potentia maximus, bonitate optimus. And we see that pretty clearly in the translation. Next, sapientia. Sapientia, again with that long a marked at the end, showing the ablative case. Sapientia. Sapientia means wisdom. With the long a at the end, it's in the ablative and it's translated in wisdom. In wisdom. He is immensus. Immensus, which means unmeasurable or immeasurable. His wisdom cannot be measured. In sapientia immensus. So the English word immense means it can't be measured. Now we change here, and I want you to notice this. We had a list of ablative nouns: essentia, hypostasi, voluntate, potentia, bonitate, all ablatives, including sapientia. And then here when we go to the next noun, we switch to the nominative case. The lesson tells us that God is lux in accessa. Lux in accessa. He is a light, lux. Inaccessa, inaccessible. That means unapproachable. And if you look at the image again, you'll notice that we have this image of the Trinity, which has been described here in the lesson. But then they have it set inside of this shining light. And as you look at this symbol of this shining light, We see here in the lesson that God is lux inaccesa. He is an inaccessible or unapproachable light. And when we read the scriptures, we'll often see that when an angel appears or when God speaks to someone, it's often said that they're blinded by some terrible light that appears. They can't even look. They've got to cover their faces or bow down to the ground. God dwells in light inaccessible. He is a lux inaccesa. He is a light inaccessible. Et tamen omnia in omnibus. Et tamen omnia in omnibus. So when we talk about God being an inaccessible light, he seems separate from us, unapproachable, far from us, and so on. And that's all true. Et tamen omnia in omnibus. So here is a strange contrast in God. He is an inaccessible light, a light that cannot be approached by man or by any creature. Et tamen, and yet, on the other hand, tamen is often translated nevertheless, but here it's translated yet. Et tamen, and yet, he is omnia in omnibus. Omnia means all things or everything. And yet he is all things in omnibus, in all things. He is everywhere. He is in all places, at all times, and yet, even though he is ever present, he is also inaccessible. So this is the mystery of the nature of God. He's an unapproachable light, and yet all things in all things. Ubique et nullibi. Ubique et nullibi. Ubique means everywhere. God is everywhere. God is ubique, and yet he is also nowhere. Nullibi, nowhere. Ubique et nullibi, everywhere and nowhere. So we see how we're learning the vocabulary that's used to describe the mystery of God's character. He is inaccessible and yet all things. He is everywhere and yet nowhere. A mystery. This lesson continues on to the next page, so let's keep going here. Summum bonum. Summum bonum. Summum means the highest, like the summit of a mountain. Summum. And you see it translated here as chiefest, the highest or greatest. And bonum means good. Summum bonum. He is the chiefest good. He is the highest good. And this word good has a special meaning. It's not just referring to a good thing, like if I said steak is good food. Bonum here means good as in something that is to be desired, an end of the human life, the purpose of the human life, that which all human life should seek, that which the whole entire universe exists for, the end of all, the chief end, the chief good, the good which all things are to desire and seek. So when it says good here, make sure you understand that to mean good as in the end that all should desire. God is the summum bonum. He is the highest good. Et solus et inexhaustus fons omnium bonorum. God is the highest good himself, the chiefest good. And et solus, the only, solus, the only, et inexhaustus. Inexhaustible means he never runs out. He is the only and inexhausted or inexhaustible fons, fountain, omnium bonorum, omnium of all bonorum, good things. So not only is he the highest good, the chief end, but he is also the only and inexhaustible source of all good things. He is the highest good and the fountain or source of all good things. He is the highest, the chiefest good, and the only and inexhaustible source of all good things. In other words, he is the highest good, and everything that can be called good receives its goodness from him. He is the source of all good that exists. Ut creator ita gubernator et conservator omnium rerum. Ut creator ita gubernator et conservator omnium rerum. As he is the creator, the creator in English, as he is the creator, ita, so also is he gubernator, the governor, et conservator, the preserver, omnium rerum. Notice we saw omnium here, we translated of all, same word here. He is the governor and preserver or conserver, omnium, of all rerum, things. Of all things, omnium rerum. As he is the creator, so is he the governor and conserver of all things. This is important because there are some people who believe that God created the world and then he leaves it to just sort of run its course. He established the laws of nature and the world just runs on its own by the law of nature, and God is far away and really doesn't intervene in human affairs. This is saying that as God is the creator, so also is he the governor. He is constantly directing all things. He is the governor of all things, and he is the conservator, the preserver of all things. So he not only made the world, but he directs it and he preserves it. He takes care of it. As the creator, so the governor and conserver of all things, omnium rerum. And all these things, as it says, as he is the creator, so also the governor and conserver of all things, quas vocamus mundum. Quas vocamus mundum. Quas is a pronoun which means which. Vocamus is a verb, we call, which we call mundum. So all things that exist, we call mundum. And notice that the next lesson, the topic is mundus. So this lesson has brought us through a study of the character of God, and then it describes him as the creator and explains that he's also the governor and preserver of all things, which we call the world. And then in the next lesson, we're going to study the vocabulary that relates to this term, the world, mundus. It's mundum here because it's the accusative case, because it's the object of the verb vocamus. Vocamus, the subject is we. That's what this mus ending shows us. The meaning of the verb is to call. That's what voca shows us. Think about the English word vocation. If I say, I am trying to discern my vocation, the word vocation means a calling. What is God calling me to do? What is my vocation? Vocamus means we call. We call these things mundum, the world. So as the creator, God is also, or so is he, the gubernator, the governor, and the conserver of all things, which we call mundum, the world. So that's all the content of this vocabulary lesson. All of it relates to the topic of Deus, or God. We've got this image that shows us an attempt to represent the Trinity, which we said is a mystery, can never be thoroughly understood. So if you read some of these things and say, I don't really think that's normal, because we're talking about a being who is infinitely greater than us. Of course, our minds are never going to be able to wrap themselves around God himself. God is greater than us. So we can know about God because God reveals things about himself. And the scriptures tell us the secret things belong to the Lord. There are many, many things that we cannot understand, and we can consider them to be mysteries or secret things. They belong to God, and really they're none of our business. But the scripture says, but what he has revealed is for us and for our children. He said that, I believe, in Deuteronomy. Moses says that. The secret things belong to the Lord, but that which has been revealed belongs to us and to our children. And so we have the revelation of God's character, where God reveals to us things about himself, and we simply accept those revelations and believe them because God has revealed them, and God cannot deceive, God cannot be deceived. We believe them because God has revealed them, and God is true. We saw in his will, he is verax, true. That's why we believe what God reveals. He has revealed these teachings about his own person. We cannot understand them entirely. Sometimes we can't understand them really at all, but we believe them because God himself has revealed them. And it's reasonable to believe in God because God is not some sort of specimen that we can bring into a laboratory and put on a table and study and examine. When people seek a scientific knowledge of God, they seek to know God in some sort of experimental way, like they want to test and see if God exists or what God is. That's actually unreasonable because God, in his essence, is spiritual. And if we think about the natural sciences are only concerned with physical bodies, whereas God, in his essence, is spiritual. So God is above and outside of the reach of human science, and the only way that we can know about him is for him to reveal himself. And he reveals himself to us in a number of ways. He reveals himself to us in the world that he created. So we can look at the world and we can see the way that God works. We can see the wisdom of God. We can see how God organizes and does things. We can discern the principles by which God orders the world. And this is what philosophers have done all through history. The Pythagoreans, for example, said, you know what's really strange? When we look at the world, we can see all kind of mathematics in the world. We can see that there's mathematical order, that there's a meaning of numbers in the world. And so mathematical things, numbers, must exist in God's mind. God must be mathematical. There are paintings you can find where God is painted as a master of geometry, and he's holding a compass measuring the earth as he creates the world. So philosophers have sought to study what can be known about God by observing the things that God has made, the natural world. We can also find God's revelation in man, in human beings, because we're made in God's image. So we can actually study ourselves and learn about God's character by understanding ourselves. Socrates, in one of Plato's dialogues, First Alcibiades, says that one of the best places to look, to see and learn about God is in the mirror. And that's the idea of seeking to know about God through what he has revealed in the things which he has made, which include human nature, which is the only thing that he made of which he said, I've made this in my own image and likeness. So we ourselves are a place to look to understand God's character, even though it's by comparison. And then lastly, God reveals himself by his word, by his spoken word, which has been written for us in the scriptures, and ultimately by the capital W word, Jesus Christ himself, which is God's final revelation. So when we study the character of God, there is mystery and there is a lot of content that simply needs to be believed because God is greater than us and our minds cannot wrap themselves around something that's greater than us. It's like a computer trying to understand a human being. There's no way that the computer can understand the human being unless the human being reveals himself and tells the computer what to say. And then all of a sudden the computer appears intelligent, but it's artificial intelligence. So anyway, that's all for this lesson in Latin vocabulary on God. We've gone through every single word in this lesson. You can go back and replay the video to study it and make sure you understand everything. I also encourage you to read it carefully and practice your pronunciation. And to help you with that, before I wrap up, I'm just going to read through the lesson from beginning to end in Latin so you can listen to it and become more comfortable. So let's just go through the Latin one more time from beginning to end. Deus est ex se ipso ab aeterno in aeternum, perfectissimum et beatissimum ens, essentia spiritualis et unus, hypostasi trinus, voluntate sanctus justus clemens verax, potentia maximus, bonitate optimus, sapientia immensus, lux inaccessa, et tamen omnia in omnibus, ubique et nullibi. Summum bonum, et solus et inexhaustus fons omnium bonorum, ut creator ita gubernator, et conservator omnium rerum, quas vocamus mundum. So that's all for lesson 2 in Latin vocabulary on the topic of God or Deus. You can watch this video, replay it, use it as much as you'd like. It's meant to help you. If there's anything that's not clear as you go through this, or if you're just curious, you have a question about a word you see, or it makes you think of something else and you'd like to ask about it, feel free to contact me anytime or post on the forum on the course page, which would even be better since other students can see it as well. But feel free to ask any questions you have. Work through this lesson to master the meaning of every word in Latin and show your mastery by completing the assessments in the lesson. I hope that's helpful. As I said, if there's anything else I can help with, please get in touch. God bless your studies.